Any adults feeling tired in here today? All right, good. Yeah, not many hands. You're the awake crowd. You're like, hey, I'm awake, so I'm going to face that cold weather and get out there. All the really tired people just said, you know what, I'm going to stay home. Jesus said, the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. It's a pretty obvious statement. I think we all have ideas in our heads, and then when it's time to actually listen to the alarm clock and get out of bed or do the things that we've been dreaming of, it takes a lot of extra effort and energy to physically go about doing the things that we can dream about and think about and have inspiration for in our hearts and our minds, right? If you hadn't noticed, we're going to talk about tiredness a little bit today, but I think it's something we all face. We all face tiredness in our life. As human beings, we are created to function with sleep and nutrition and various things, right? Like a tree needs sunlight, it needs water, it needs good soil. Like there's a recipe for health and growth that you watch in plants, you watch in other things. Human beings, sleep is one of ours, right? We need sleep. And when that gets messed with, it can really affect us, right? Anybody feel like, hey, I get really cranky when I have no sleep? Or I'm not going to be very helpful, right? Being tired can be a frustration, especially if it's ongoing. I got a list of what some experts say might be reasons for why you're tired, so let's check that out. The first is the most obvious. Lack of sleep, right? Not enough sleep. We're supposed to get at least 7 hours, and sometimes we don't because of choice, or sometimes even something against our will like insomnia. That can be really hard. For those of you that suffer with that, when you want to sleep and you can't, that is excruciating, right? And nutrition deficiencies, our poor diet, right? Those are things that can affect us if we don't get enough vitamins, if we have too much sugar, processed foods, don't have enough proteins, vegetables, like everything out of balance can really mess with our ability to sleep. Stress. If you are stressed, you can, especially when that stress is ongoing and you don't find relief, it can create anxieties. It can create struggle to fall asleep. Medical conditions, physically, mentally, anything that affects us, medically can affect how we are capable of sleeping. Too much caffeine. I put a bunch of question marks in my notes on that one because I'm like, gosh, that one actually feels counterintuitive. But if you have too much caffeine, what it does is it messes with your body's ability to calm down and get good enough sleep at night because you've been awake and alert artificially. And so too much of that can actually throw off your body's ability to get into regular sleep patterns, and it'll affect you the next day. So it might help you momentarily, but it's actually going to hurt you in the long run. I have caffeine. I had a Starbucks this morning, right? Like Sundays, sometimes that's a little treat to make sure that I've got the energy to do this with you all. But if we have too much or we become dependent and reliant upon that rather than sleep, it can really mess us up, throw us off. Hydration's important because if you're not hydrated enough, you have decreased energy and concentration. Obesity leads to an increased risk for chronic illnesses, which can affect sleep, as well as sleep apnea can be an issue. Drugs and alcohol lead to increased fatigue. An inactive lifestyle leads to low energy levels. That one reminded me of you ever leave a rubber band in a drawer too long, and then you go to pull it because it hasn't been doing its job, and like that thing just snaps right apart because it's just more plasticky than rubbery at that point. It's not used. It's not staying in shape, right? And then even medications, you guys know there's things, side effects out there. A lot of them are sleeplessness, right? Some make you more drowsy, but other ones keep you awake. And there's a struggle to figure out how to utilize all that stuff. There's a whole lot of reasons we don't get sleep, right? So here's a list of a bunch that some experts put out on some lists. But we're going to talk more about tiredness and hopefully glean from the Lord today what we can do about that, how we can lean into things that the Lord has designed for us to combat that. But I think if we think about being tired, momentarily, that's hard, right? Like, last night was a rough night of sleep. I got to go to work today. It's going to be a hard day. Like a momentary thing like that by itself in a vacuum can be hard as it is. I think there's some of us out here as well who face that not momentarily, but it becomes long-lasting. You can have fatigue over a period of time where suddenly it's not just, I'm tired today. I'm like, I'm stuck in a cycle of tiredness and I don't know how to get out, and it affects every part of my life, right? I think we live in a world where a lot of people are cycling through their days amidst exhaustion and fatigue and tiredness. And it's not just oh, it's hitting me for this moment, but it's become, how do I adapt to just getting used to that, adjusting my routines, adjusting how my brain functions, how I make decisions. How do I wrap my brain around that, right? That constant feeling of being tired, which can also lead you to feeling overwhelmed pretty regularly. It affects our daily routine, but it can even make a difference in how we make decisions for our life. I don't know if I'm going to commit to something because I am just so worn out. I don't think I'm going to have space for that thing in my life at some point in the near future. It starts to affect how we foresee our schedules, our relationships. Tiredness and exhaustion, if we don't figure it out, can really impact us negatively. So today, we're going to explore how Jesus combated exhaustion. Yes, Jesus got tired. Jesus had a human body, right? He was often working hard at whatever he did. Before a lot of his public ministry that we read about, he was a carpenter. He had an understanding of what manual labor looked like. He also ministered to many large crowds. He worked with a lot of people. Talk about exhausting. Jeez, working with crowds of people. Wear you out. Well, one point in his ministry, Jesus, he's wrapping up this long day of ministering to the crowds. He's speaking, he's teaching. I can't even imagine doing it at the level he did. It was like every day, all day, that's all he did. He'd heal people, he'd teach, he'd talk. He's constantly pouring out and speaking. I'm like, gosh, how did he keep his voice? Right, all of that. At the end of a really long day, at one point, he actually got into a boat with the disciples and he fell asleep, right? You ever we have a lot of visuals of Jesus, but I don't think one that comes to mind is probably not him laying down with his eyes closed, like Jesus asleep, right? I was even thinking of that. I was like, that'd be crazy if I could just sit next to God while he's sleeping. That's an interesting thought, right? I think if I could just watch him talk to people, heal people, have him teach me something. I'm like, what a moment the disciples had where they actually got to just witness God asleep. Jesus, the Son of God in flesh, like God in the flesh, right? Sleeping, responding to his hard work with rest, right? Mark 4:38. Video screen in a lobby. It's back. Thank you for shaking your head as if you did something, but it did it all by itself. Great. I'll leave that up here just in case. Mark 4:38. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. They had cushions back then. They weren't just rocks like you read about, Jacob having a dream and, making a monument after that because he laid his head on a rock. Jesus had a cushion in a boat. It's kind of like a waterbed, right? Just laying there sleeping. Jesus was born with a human body. If you ever we'll do a class again sometime soon, hopefully. We do this class we call Essentials, where we talk about just different theological concepts. We talk about how Jesus came to earth as a man. While still fully God, the Bible talks about how he gave up his divine privileges. So Jesus didn't come down like Superman amongst people who had all these extra strength abilities that we didn't have. Said he actually chose to insert himself into the human existence. He had a frail body that bled and got tired. So that's the life that he chose for the 33 years he lived before he sacrificed himself for the sake of all mankind to have salvation, right? He had a body like us that was subjected to tiredness. He knew the value of getting rest. It's something his father did, that God did in the book of Genesis. Work, rest after all your work. And sit back, enjoy, take some rest moments, right? Working hard and resting. Jesus actually continues to rest in this boat, even when a storm approaches as they're out at sea. That's one thing I admire about Jesus. He is able to find rest in places that we might get scared to take a break because, something might come at us if we let our guard down a little bit. He knows I can rest. I can find peace in this. Let's read this full passage here in Mark 4 to kind of see the context of all this. We're going to read through verses 35 through 41. It says, as evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross to the other side of the lake. So they're done with their ministry time with the crowds. So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. Jesus couldn't even get away from everybody all the time. They were constantly following him. You ever feel like you can't rest because things never leave you alone, right? Like being a parent, you can never stop being attentive to your kids, even when they're sleeping and you want to get some rest. Your job, sometimes you're on call and you have to be ready at a moment's notice, depending upon what your job is. Right? Like there's seasons of life where it feels like you just can't get away to fully rest. Soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. So here's a little more context. He wasn't just sleeping in that boat. He was sleeping in the boat during that storm when water was coming over the sides. It says the disciples woke him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown? God, don't you care that I'm going through this? Don't you see me? Don't you know?" Like, you guys aren't the only ones that came up with that thinking and that phrasing, right? The disciples had the same thought process. You are just like the disciples, me. We're all in human flesh, trying to figure this out with the same reactions. God, where are you in this? Why aren't you paying attention? Why aren't you doing something, right? When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." And suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. Like, I love even that they use the scriptures use the word calm. It wasn't just like, and the storm stopped. It was like suddenly what felt really crazy suddenly shifted into a moment of peace. Right? There was a calmness after this storm hit because Jesus stepped in and did something. And he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Like, he's not challenging them on, do you believe enough? And like the storm came because you didn't do enough. Like, God's not getting into that theological debate with the disciples. He's really asking, do you remember who you're in the boat with? Don't you trust me? Do you think I can handle this with you? The disciples were absolutely terrified. Who is this man? And it's interesting they say man there because they're following him because they know he's the Son of God. He's the Christ. He's the prophesied Messiah, born Son of God. But again, in their human brains, they're seeing a storm and they're watching him interact in this, not only calming the storm, but just the way that he does it. It's outside of their comprehension. Like how hard it is to comprehend God's love, like we talked about and we were singing about and we get into, right? Like, how hard it is to comprehend the peace that Jesus has, the power with God that he's able to operate with. They were just stunned at what he had just done. Even the wind and waves obey him. Like, they're just in awe of him. So in this story, we find a group of people exhausted and facing a storm that sound like much of our world today. Groups of people exhausted and facing the storms. And then we also see that God is with this group, yet they still feel afraid. Also sounds familiar. Sounds like my life sometimes. Oh yeah, God's with me. Why would I need to be afraid of this storm? I think a lot of us face storms and God is with us, yet we can find ourselves in just the same position as the disciples, freaking out a little bit and wondering what God's going to do and possibly doubtful over how this is going to turn out. But when the people turn to God, they actually choose to get him to respond. He hears them, he responds, and then he invites them to trust him in the midst of the storm as they're out at sea. All right? We are all going to be in a boat called life. We're all going to be in a moment. We're all going to be in a situation. We're all going to be in a relationship. We're all going to face some circumstance that's going to feel rocky amidst and possibly even feel like the storm has swelled up larger than we could have anticipated, and we feel overwhelmed at how are we going to survive this. We're all going to face some of those moments. But having Jesus in your boat makes a big difference, don't you think? Being alone and doing it by yourself and not having God with you in that, good luck trying to survive. But when you have God in your boat, all you need to do is reach out and grab a hold of him and ask him to work, ask him to move, and then trust the outcome will be one that you will survive and see God's goodness shine through amidst what you're facing in that, right? I want to talk through some things that I think are important for us today as we reflect on the concept of tiredness and exhaustion in our lives, and as we just see the heart of God and how He showed us how to handle some of this. First, let's just acknowledge the obvious. You will get tired and exhausted. And that's not a surprise to God because He made you. He designed you to need sleep. If you want to challenge God on that, good luck. I had a friend in college who said, I am going to test something out and try to not sleep as long as I can. He was one of those crazy guys who just loved to just do a challenge of any kind. He would climb buildings on campus and videotape it and post it online to try and see what he could do and get away with. But he's like, I'm going to test something out. I'm going to try to not sleep. And I think like 3 days later, he conked out and slept for a really long time. But I remember him like sharing later, he was like, yeah, I wasn't learning anything in class anymore. I wasn't retaining information. And like all the things that started to affect him in that were going negative, were going south, right? Like we're not designed to go without sleep. God made you to rest. He made your physical body, your mental health, everything about you. He made you to need rest, to need sleep, right? Tiredness should actually be something helpful for reflecting a bit on our life. I think in a moment, if you're frustrated that you're feeling tired, say, hey, let me reflect on this tiredness for a moment. Am I tired because I've been doing a lot of really hard work that feels purposeful, that feels God-honoring, that is blessing me and others, right, in my life? Do I feel tired about that? Can I feel good about this tiredness? Or am I tired because there's some areas of my life that need addressing? Am I making bad choices? Am I facing things in a place where I don't trust God as much and I'm relying more on my control and I'm getting wrapped up in the anxieties of what I can and can't handle, right? What is my tiredness coming from? Right? Am I choosing things that, maybe even things from the list we read? Have I done that? Have I put myself in a place that I don't need to be in, where all this tiredness is coming from? That's not how God designed us, where we get tired because we're wearing ourselves out for things that aren't purposeful, that aren't adding to what God's called. But if we're working hard, if we're living a life of purpose the way God's called us, and tiredness comes because we are giving our full effort. Those are two very different things, right? Tiredness could actually be a moment where we reflect and say, why am I tired? Is this a good tired? Like, is this coming for a good reason or not? Or is there something I need to work on? I often thank God for the source of my tiredness because it mostly comes from parenting my children, right? I prayed and prayed and prayed. My wife and I prayed for years through infertility. We have kids. We feel guilty in the moments when we complain about how hard it can be because we prayed for it. But ultimately, I have to turn and say, thank you, God, for the life that I have. Because amidst this tiredness, it's because of something really good. You've blessed us, and I get an opportunity not only to be tested in my character and my patience and that as a parent, but the tiredness that comes from it is because God has called me to give and to pour out into my children, right? Like, I think if you're giving and pouring out into others for good reasons, and you're not enabling someone's codependency, or you're not propping up somebody's bad habits. Like, if you're pouring out because there's a loving connection that God has established for you to actually help other people in, that's a good tiredness, right? If you are working unto the Lord instead of people, like the Bible talks about, and you are giving God your full effort and you're tired because of that, that's a really good tiredness, right? It can be something we reflect on. I also have to acknowledge my own moments where I fail to rest, where I've chosen to watch a show instead of go to bed sooner, and I've stayed up too late and I've not gotten enough sleep, and my little sleep app on my watch will tell me that, because I wear this at night and it's not as uncomfortable as you might think, or maybe it would be for you. I don't know. We all have different interests in that, but or there's times where I know I can fill the gaps in my life, or I can fill the spaces where I should be resting sometimes with more busyness, because I have a list in my head of all the things that I get done, and I think if I accomplish that list, I'll have plenty of time to rest after. Does that list ever end? We lie to ourselves, don't we? That this list, if we just knock it out, we'll get there. We'll have the best rest ever. Any people retired that thought that was going to be very restful, and it's not so restful, right? Like, we have this illusion in our heads that we're all working towards these things, and that working hard will get us there, but then we work ourselves to the bone, and it's not what it's meant for. And then my I think, worst case scenario at the end of my life would be that I look back and I go, wow, like, I missed a lot of things that I could have gotten better. And I think one of the things that God's highlighting to us, no matter what season of your life that you're in right now, you're never too young or too old to think about this and start it now. God, where can I insert more rest so that I can experience you more, have more peace amidst the storms, and operate the way you designed me? All right, fun verse I came across, think about Proverbs 19:15. Lazy people sleep soundly, but idleness leaves them hungry. Now, first when I threw that in there, like, is this counterintuitive to my points? Lazy people sleep? No, like, it's saying that second part, idleness leaves them hungry. If you're working hard, that's the good tiredness, right? Like, but if you're not working hard, you can sleep, you can rest, but like the lack of working hard is what leads us to not have the things that God's designed us to have, right? Like, working hard is really good. I pray that we all find a good work ethic. It's something like I try to tell my kids. Like, my son Judah loves to throw the football a lot. And I'm trying to not, yes, I like to celebrate him when he makes cool catches or a good throw. But I also try to say, I really enjoy how much you practice, how hard you work to learn this. Like, I want him to grow in that, because my prayer would be that at some point he learns to rest as a response to the hard work, and there's a balance of the two. I think sometimes we can work so hard that we never rest, and other times we can rest so much that we never work. And God's really looking for us, like in many areas of our life, to find a balance of the good things that he has set before us, right? Are we working hard enough to get tired and to live the life that God's called us? If that's the tiredness we're facing, again, I think we're in a good spot. We also have to be wise and know when we need God to help us with stuff, because I think sometimes we can take that work into our own hands. We can make it our effort. We can even make resting some big working effort that doesn't work, right? Like, we can take a lot of things under our own control. So, God, how do I invite you in? Because there's a lot of times there are things that any of us in here might face that will inhibit our ability to rest, and it might be something that we just can't flip this switch on, and we need his assistance. And God, help me with the bad habits that I've formulated, right? Maybe it's the things that I'm addicted to, substances, or staying up late to binge watch something, or scroll Facebook for an hour. It felt like 5 minutes, but it took an hour, right? Like, God, help me make some better choices during the moments when I should be restful. Lord, help me in the moments when I'm facing something out of my control, like an illness or a disease that I've been diagnosed with that actually impacts and affects my ability to get the sleep that my body needs. God, help me. Situations that just get out of our control. Help me, Lord. I can't fix what's going on at work. I can't fix what's happening between me and another person in a relationship. I'm going to try, but God, there's so much, it's so beyond what I can do to figure it out. Help me, Lord, right? We're all going to face this stuff. God knows. He's waiting to be invited into that. One of the most important things I think we also need to understand is that prioritizing rest is the will of God. I think we sometimes convince ourselves otherwise. Because hard work is so important and God actually values that, we sometimes think, well, then the opposite is not godly, that resting is laziness, and I don't want to not get anything done, or I don't want to get stuck feeling behind. Like, I need to succeed. I need to show everybody I can do it. I need to prove to my boss. I need to show my friends and my family that I am this person that I hope they see me as. Like, I need to earn that raise, or what if I don't get that and everything falls apart? Like, we're always trying to figure out how to keep our footing on solid ground through our strength, through our efforts, through all of that. But also finding a really good foundation to put your foot on that is called rest, and stopping there a moment and letting God meet you in that spot is godly. It is his will that you would find space for that in your life. I think it's very tempting to choose to avoid rest, to not slow down. Right? Again, I think we are taught in the world of capitalism we live in the United States that it's noble to be a hard worker by continuing to go, and, hey, I work even on my days off. I'm getting it all done. I'm conquering the world, right? Like, it feels like you are going to be a winner if you don't stop and you just keep going and going and going. I think, again, I mentioned it before, I think we can be afraid of being perceived as someone who's lazy if we don't do enough. Like, oh, I got to keep up with my coworkers or they're going to think I'm the problem here. Or like, I gotta, keep up some image of being a hard worker, even if it's a struggle to do so. I think some of us actually just overcommit ourselves, and you feel like you can't slow down. If I pause or I stop, the things that I have done in my life will fall apart. I can't find time in my schedule for an hour with God this week because I have too much on my plate. And it will hurt my family, it'll hurt my coworkers, it'll hurt my employees, it'll hurt my bottom line, right? Like, we almost sometimes live in life spaces where we don't create enough margin for the restfulness that God has led us to have, right? In this world, it is normal to go, go, go. And rest is countercultural, right? To turn off the devices, like Tom said, that's countercultural. To quiet ourselves, to listen versus talk, to be those that find a still space in the midst of a busy life. It feels like you're going against the current. It feels hard to do, right? I think sometimes we attempt to find that quick fix helps us keep going. Or I also think there's times when we think we're just strong enough. I can do that. I'm just going to push through. I'll rest later. When I was early on in college, another friend, my pre-Jesus days when we were partying in the fraternity I was in, I had a friend who said, I'll sleep when I die. There's time to sleep when I'm dead. Fortunately, that's probably going to happen for him sooner than later if he keeps living by that motto. It was almost like this disregard for the need of sleep. Like, that's not as important. I can figure that out. The problem with these kinds of approaches is it relies on our strength. It relies on us trying to force this machine of a body that God has designed for us to work in ways that God did not design it to, right? I'm going to make it work. Like, my gas is running low. Doesn't matter. I can make it another 100 miles. Thankfully, they actually, when that gas light goes on, they do give you a little bit of extra leeway, but it's not 100 miles, right? Like, we have to know when it's time to stop and fill up and make sure that we are having everything in the tank that we need to keep going in all of that, right? I think if you think you know your limits, or you try to go beyond the limits that you think you have when you're tired, you can actually break down from avoiding rest and pushing forward. In my life, I've done that. I've done this. Years ago, I had some people that likened me to this character from a movie called Monsters and Aliens. He was a giant blue blob. We got that photo up there. I had some people that told me, like, hey, you're kind of like that blob guy from that movie, because they're in these like battle scenes and everybody's firing stuff at him and it just goes boom, 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 and goes in. He's like, like, he can just take it. He can just deal with it. It's not hurting him. He's a blob, right? Like, the impact just gets absorbed and there's no pain, and he just happily goes about his life. I had another roommate in college who once told me, he's like, does anything ever bother you? Do you have any problems? Because I tend to have a more easygoing, let it roll off my back kind of personality. As I've gotten older, I've learned more that sometimes that looks that way on the outside because I've stuffed things in enough and ignored them enough where it might appear that way, but I have more I should be dealing with, and I'm working that out with God as I grow older as well. How do I do that? But I remember I thought it was so... I felt so honored for people to think of me as this person that could handle so much and not be overtaken and overwhelmed, that you were just, the resilience of that. But that perceived strength has a limit, right? Like I shared recently, again, about a year ago when my heart went into AFib. My wife even reminded me, she's like, about a year ago, you were sick way more often than I've ever seen you. Like I was dealing with anxiety and stress. I was not getting enough sleep. I was physically sick and getting sickness. I was dealing with stuff like, not eating right, and my body was, having like acid reflux issues, and there's a whole list of things that were all starting to not work. Like, it's one thing if your gas light goes on in the car, but if the gas light goes on, and then your tire pressure light goes on, and then you're hearing a grinding sound, it's like, if all these things are going on, it's like something needs to happen, right? Like, I think I've learned a lesson with my car, because I've done that in the past too. I should pay attention to each individual thing as it comes, so that it doesn't hit me like a ton of bricks if it all compiles together and there goes the car, right? Like, there's things that we should pay more attention to. Our perceived strength has its limits. And I think some of you probably feel like you've got bigger limits than others, and that might be true. But nobody is limitless. We all have a place and a point in time when if we don't get enough rest and we push ourselves too hard on our own strength and we don't rest in the Lord, we will break down physically, mentally, emotionally. All of us have those limits that get crossed if we don't figure out where God is in the midst of our life and slow down enough to get in space with Him, rest with Him, allow Him to fill us up, not only so we can go back and do it again, but now go forward with Him in charge, with Him leading us, showing us how to do that. Look what Jesus said here, Matthew chapter 11, 28 through 30. He said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens." And he's like, hey, he doesn't say, go figure it out. Hey, drop some of those things you're doing too much. What's his answer? Come to me, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. That sounds really good, doesn't it? Find rest for your soul. Not just like, oh, I needed a little extra energy boost from a power nap. I want my soul to feel rest, right? For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. There's something about Jesus saying that, and our imagination of what it would feel like to have Him in charge, where He's carrying the burdens and giving us peace and rest even to a soul level. Something that just feels so energizing about thinking about that. Like, if God could just carry the weight, if I could live in such a way where God took the burdens from me and I could find peace in Him, right? Jesus desires for us to find rest in this life. And the only way to truly experience that is with Him. So, if there's any motto you walk away with today, don't be a blob, embrace Jesus. Don't do it on your own. Don't think that you can handle it all. Yeah, resilience is good, strength is good, but make sure it's God's strength, not your own. Don't do this without Him. Find that place with God. Here's something you can count on. When you rest in God, you can feel safe in every storm. Doesn't mean you're like, bring it on. Had another, there's a couple have been friends with in ministry. I used to work at another church with many years ago, and musicians and singers and songwriters, and they wrote this song called Bring On That Storm. And they wrote this, produced it. It even got picked up as a single on a Rita Springer album, if you've ever heard her name in the worship realm. And they wrote the song called Bring On That Storm, and within the next year, like, everything in life just hit them. So it's like, I'm not going to think like, okay, God's like up there saying, fine, that's not how God's going to work. But I think sometimes we don't need to live in that place where we're like, I'm going to get cocky about the strength that God gives me. Let's just know that life has storms that we don't have to ask for. They'll come anyway. Can we find peace regardless of whether there's a storm or not? We can, but it's not by whatever we figure out. It's by resting in God, drawing close to Him, knowing how much He loves us, embracing that, also slowing down enough to follow Him, listen to Him. Right? We not only want to find rest so that we can have more physical energy. Like, yeah, that sounds great. Again, I watch my son throw and catch the football all day long, and I think, gosh, I could do this with him for 10 minutes and I'm worn out. Like, I wish I had that energy back. But there's also a peace that God gives us that can benefit us mentally, emotionally, stuff that really, again, brings rest and peace at a soul level. Listen to this description of our God here, Isaiah chapter 40. Have you never heard? Have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of His understanding. Now, this is not talking about the human body Jesus had, right? But even though His body was growing weak and weary, and He was facing fear and loneliness and that, like, He knew where His peace was found. It was in His Father, right? No one can measure the depths of His understanding. He gives power to the weak and strength to the powerless. When you feel weak and powerless, know the one who can turn that around. Not to make you better, but to show who he is in the midst of that if you rest in him and find him in the middle of all that. Even youths will become weak and tired. Even those students coming back from camp, they're going to be worn out, parents. So, yeah, you're like, yes, give them that long nap when they get back. That'll feel good. But young men will fall in exhaustion, but those who trust in the Lord will find new strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. God is greater than any storm we could ever face. And God's more powerful than any amount of work that could pile up on our schedules. God does not grow weary amidst any child's temper tantrum. Lord, give me your strength. Jesus showed us what it looked like to be rocked by the ways of life, yet still find a place of rest in a relationship with his Father, right? To know that God is good, and even the storms cannot derail his goodness in our lives and how he can meet us and fill us and lead us through all of that, right? The peace that Jesus found wasn't based on an outcome of a circumstance, but by the very presence of God in the midst of anything, right? The disciples didn't make it out of the storm because they knew how to sail and figure it all out. They had Jesus in the boat with them, right? Jesus said in John 16:33, I've told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. Don't think you won't. But take heart because I have overcome the world. We need to do life with the overcomer. We need to meet him in every space and let him lead us through all of those things. King David wrote this in Psalm chapter 4. Many people say, who will show us better times? Let your face smile on us, Lord. You have given me greater joy than those who have abundant harvests of grain and new wine. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, will keep me safe. I go to a man who had a hard life, made a ton of mistakes, and paid the price for those mistakes, right? Still seen as a man after God's own heart. We did a whole series on him if you want to go on our website, if you weren't around back then or missed some of those. David had a rough, busy, storm-filled life, and he still found a way to get with God and write his heart to the Lord in these Psalms that talks about finding peace and rest in God, right? There's no replacement for the peace and rest that God can give us. Coffee can help for a moment. Your energy drinks, right? The song you can put on your headphones before you got to go into an energized moment and pump yourself up. We can find these little artificial substitutes, but our own strength will always run out. We need true godly rest in our lives to be the best version of ourselves that God's created us to be, right? He's given us an operator's manual. We're reading from it today. It talks about how we need rest to make sure that we operate at maximum efficiency, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, relationally. Like all of this stuff matters. And if we get the equation off and we think we can rewrite the equation on how our bodies work, our minds work, our hearts work, that's not going to work. Only the way God designed it, which involves resting in him. That's the best place to be in. Even the most prominent people in history faced this and had to acknowledge it. King Solomon was usually referred to as one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and an extremely famous king in his day. One of David's sons, the one who actually got to be present for the building of the first temple that David was given plans for, but wasn't meant for him. It was meant for the next generation, right? Solomon got to rise to power and had it all. Well, he's the epitome of been there, done that, tried it all. He even says so. He's like, it's all vanity. Trying to figure all this out on your own and have everything in the world, doesn't matter. It's a vanity. It's like chasing the wind, right? Have you tried that? Can you go catch the wind? Can you go chase after it and grab a hold of it? It's impossible, right? He's tried all this stuff. And there's a moment here after they build the temple where he makes a declaration that I think is really meaningful here. In 1 Kings chapter 8, it says, praise the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the wonderful promises he gave through his servant Moses. He's acknowledging who God is and who God's talked about being over time. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. And if you read about some of these passages in the Old Testament, these ancestors he's talking about, God was with the Israelites in the desert. He showed up as a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. He showed up to Moses in the burning bush. He made himself very present and evident, and Solomon's like, may you be with us. I would echo, God, can you do that still with us today? Be with us just as you've always been with your people. Be with us, Lord. And may he never leave us or abandon us. That's not our God, right? It's not who he is. May he give us the desire to do his will in everything and to obey all the commands, decrees, and regulations that he gave our ancestors. Right? God gives rest. He's designed us to do life with him. And before we end today, as the band, you've noticed the band's come back up, team's back up here. Our worship leaders are going to create space for us to connect with God one more time. But I want to do it a little different today. I'm going to invite you to stay seated today. I want you to sit down. You can kneel or lay down if you got enough chairs open next to you, or you want to see how good of a mopping job our cleaning crew does. I want you to find space to rest a little bit this morning in the Lord. You can sing if you want, if that feels restful to you. You can close your eyes and even fall asleep for the next 5 minutes or so if that feels helpful. You can pray if you have a journal and journaling feels peaceful to you. Like, I know we're all going back out to a busy life, busy day, busy week. I don't know what's all going on. We're facing stuff. My hope is we're just going to take another few minutes of having a moment to rest in the Lord. Sometimes even letting the words of a song wash over you, and a song that's written about God and his heart for us. Maybe let that soak into your heart today. Don't work hard at this. Just allow yourself to rest. Allow your guard against the vulnerability of resting to come down for a moment. Let God into that, just where you're at. Let God into that space with you to rest here in this moment. Ask him to meet you. If you're struggling to rest, say, God, help me. Let's find rest in him here in this moment for this song. And hopefully this could be an example to us of what this could look like in other ways in our week outside of church too. Let's do this together.